gamble like that is a pretty big one to make.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so the Wrestling Observer also reports that Meltzer writes about the kind of gamble that he thinks that Vince McMahon's taken with this and the WWF in general, giving, literally saying in this case, the way they've portrayed Shamrock as being this big UFC world's most dangerous man type character. That they're bringing him in a certain way, and whether it pays off, like to have him coming in over their own WWF guys, will have to pretty much just be fathomed out in the weeks to come, essentially, in all this. But it's kind of I guess it's it's seen by a lot of people as kind of a big move. He reports also that this made more waves in the MMA world than it did the wrestling world. And a lot of MMA fans were shocked to see Ken Shamrock go to quote unquote the fake stuff of WWF. So interesting. So the belief is that Ken Shamrock will debut in the WWF in a non-wrestling role at WrestleMania, with the speculation backstage on the Raw tapings that he would wind up being a referee in a submissions-only match between Bret Hart and Steve Austin. Of course, that literally did happen, but before we get to that point, there are other segments where they use Shamrock, I guess, as a kind of promotion tool towards WrestleMania. March 10th, 1997, it's reported that the 8-match pay-per-view card kind of is pretty much put out there and announced that Ken Shamrock will be the announced referee in this match. As a way of coming in, Matt, what did you think about, because I remember seeing Shamrock. That was the first time I kind of saw Shamrock, was probably at WrestleMania 13, and they kind of sold the whole thing on me that this is the world's most dangerous man. He's here to referee these two guys. Obviously, we everybody knows the whole Bret Hart Stone Cold Steve Austin match goes down as one of the absolute classics. Is this a good way at this point, Matt? Looking back, is this a good way of bringing Shamrock in to begin with to WWF? Have you got any problems with this, or do you think they could have done something better at this point?
No, I think actually it was a great idea at the time to do it that way. It'd be too much pressure just to sort of announce a match and then have him come in, and like you said, when there was people out there assuming that he had gone to the fake stuff, even though like wrestling is a real sport and it is hard to do, but like people will have those kind of remarks, I suppose, especially back then. There was a lot of stigma towards that. So yeah, I think it was a good way. Bring him in nice and slow, and show off, especially at the end when he has to separate them, and he throws Bret Hart across, and it makes it look like Bret Hart doesn't want to have anything to do with him.
Sure.
I guess it does portray him in a sort of a big man image, which I think was pretty good because Bret Hart was one of their top guys back then. So to have him sort of back down from him makes him come across quite strong, I guess.
Yeah. Shamrock was quoted around this time in about the middle of March in a daytime Daily News as saying, "What closed the door to me on the no-holds-barred fighting was I couldn't make enough money to support my family. If I do something like I can support my family, I would continue to do so. The minute I can't, I've got to do something else." So it seems like, giving that interview, it seemed like maybe it was, it could have been a financial thing for Shamrock. Maybe, you're going out there. I mean, no disrespect and not anything on the wrestling guys, but back then UFC was kind of a sport where anything could happen, and 1 minute you could be healthy, and the next maybe making a living, isn't going to happen. So if there is an easier way, I think you would literally go for that and jump at the chance. So I think I can kind of guesstimate why he would have wanted to do WWF if he had already tried his hand at professional wrestling anyway. Kind of makes a lot more sense. In that angle. Okay, it's reported as well at the same time, while the WWF where his success is far less certain than New Japan, where it would be almost a given. Simply, the WWF put more money on the table. They made the investment, and after losing out on a major talent in the past, it's up to the WWF to make the investment pay off. Whether they have had the foresight to pull it off is another question. But they're referring, Matt, right there, I believe do you remember Dennis Rodman, when he kind of slipped into WCW, was kind of like a huge big deal. Well, he was, at the time, he was in negotiations with the WWF. I don't want to go too far into it, because I'm sure we'll cover this at some point, but Rodman was literally going to be brought in for an angle with Goldust, and I think Rodman's relationship at the time was more with the likes of Hulk Hogan. He kind of had good relationships with those guys, and eventually decided that he'd rather stick it with WCW, and I believe they've done some really good business with it, and it seems like WWF were kind of not, we're going to go and do everything in their powers to get Shamrock and make sure that he's not another guy that jumps to WCW at this point, and they certainly wanted to get their hands on him before anything else from WCW happens. So it looks like a little bit of a bidding war almost in that sense, that they've gone for this one in general. So let's move on then, shall we, to a little bit further down the line. March 17th, and we've actually got all stuff about Dennis Rodman, and it's the whole signing and the latest media star of the moment, brought into pro wrestling as a publicity stunt in an announcement made by WCW over the weekend. So it seems like WCW are making a huge deal about this. They're getting the exposure, they're getting the television. Of course, former NBA player. He'd done some pretty wild things as well, Rodman, around that time. So he was kind of a very much in the limelight kind of guy at that time. Here's some fun facts around the same sort of time as well. Former Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle apparently worked an indie wrestling show in Pittsburgh area in the 15th of February of 1997, Matt. So there you go, Kurt Angle himself. Also, interesting fact here, and of course we covered WrestleMania 13 just recently on our Wrestling Skull podcast, if anybody's interested in that. But WrestleMania is reported still to have 3,000 to 4,000 tickets left at press time. And this is being reported on the 17th of March, Matt. How crazy is that to think, like, especially nowadays, that there would be that many tickets left, Matt, for a WrestleMania? I mean, that's just ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like, the numbers they're getting now, like over 100,000. Oh man, I couldn't imagine people just like letting those tickets slide these days. I'd snap them up, if I was in the area. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's also reported that Bruce Pritchard called the UFC up, trying to get rights to use Ken Shamrock's UFC footage on WWF television. This is a deal that would eventually. And I'm sure I covered this further down the line, but at first UFC were really not interested about having anything to do with the WWF, and they certainly weren't interested in giving up footage. But it seemed, Matt, like, and I remember when they finally did get the footage, but it seemed like they needed to get that footage, Matt, because it's one thing to keep saying Ken Shamrock's the world's most dangerous man, and he's this and he's that, but back then, it's worth pointing out, this is 1997. You haven't got the luxuries of YouTube. You haven't got the luxuries of, internet is still a very early part of everything. People are not looking up stuff all the time. So how important, Matt, do you think it was for WWF to get those rights and that kind of footage for Ken Shamrock going forward, in your mind?
Well, it would have been quite important, I imagine, just to try and portray him as a credible threat, and to show off like what he can do. It would just take longer, I guess, if you don't have that, just to actually build him up slowly in the ring and actually show it on their kind of footage that they can gather. It would take a lot longer, I imagine. But it would be doable still. But it's nice to actually come in with a sort of big bang straight away.
Absolutely. Okay, so now let's get to WrestleMania then. Took place on March 31st, 1997. Of course, a match between Bret Hart and Steve Austin. In the Wrestling Observer, the match is given a total 5 stars. It's one of the best matches. I recommend this match for anybody listening. It's a tremendous match, submissions match. One of the best you're going to see, I think, of all times. Ken Shamrock, his part in it, called the match. And of course, at the end, Hart still got a large babyface pop for the win, but the crowd began to turn on him when he attacked Austin's knee after the match. Finally, Shamrock got behind Hart, suplexed him to break up the post-match attack. Shamrock and Hart squared off, and Hart backed off, kind of like the heel, I guess, kind of backing down slightly. This was a big pop from the audience, seeing Shamrock like this. And again, we always remember how Austin kind of hopped himself all the way to the back. But, it seemed like when I saw that happen at WrestleMania 13, like I remember when I was watching it live, Matt, that I kind of thought to myself, that's surely got to be penciled in, Bret Hart, Ken Shamrock, down the line. Because, when you think of Bret Hart, there's the submissions guy that he is as well, that reputation. And then you're getting Ken Shamrock, who, is arguably the guy that was putting all the submissions on in UFC. You think this is a dream match. Was that your thinking as well when you saw that match and how it played out towards the end, Matt?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I thought that would be like a great first rivalry for him. And for all the reasons you just stated, we know now that Ken Shamrock was a great technical wrestler, but we didn't know, I suppose, at the time, being that he was yet to show us what he could do. But it would have been a great sort of mix, them two going at it, and come in at that level, make a big name for yourself immediately. And it did look like they could bring it up. But Bret Hart was on the turn anyway, and they could have brought Shamrock in as a massive face in that match.
Absolutely. Okay, fun fact here. Preliminary reports, this is just after WrestleMania, that they did a 0.77 buy rate, an estimated 2.4 million company gross, which can't be spun as anything other than a disaster, Meltzer reports. Last year's Mania, for comparison purposes, did a 1.2, and that figure was the lowest for any Mania show in history previous. So this was not a very successful WrestleMania in terms of TV revenue and all the rest of it. The low number wasn't unexpected at Titan. Of course, Titan back then, I may bring these up a few times, they were kind of like WWF's kind of owners in a sense before they went public on the stock. So when I mention them, that's who they are. But they kind of it was a bit of a disaster, WrestleMania 13, in terms of revenue. Certainly wasn't perceived as the best one. Okay, so the night following WrestleMania, they did a Ken Shamrock UFC video showing lots of UFC footage. It's reported there was more to this than meets the eye. It's part of a working relationship between the two promotions, that being UFC and WWF. Both groups are going to cooperate with each other in regard to footage. So you might see some footage on UFC of WWF and vice versa. So that was a very interesting deal that was broke back then. The fact that both companies were going to then help each other out after a sort of a not welcoming kind of deal at first that was going to happen. But it seems like the advertising for UFC kind of did help a little bit. More on their side, like it was helpful that WWF did this, because UFC at this point was not a massive was not a massive thing at all. So it's interesting that they done that. And, you know, they showed lots of different stuff. Of course, they showed the Lion Dens fights as well and stuff like that on there. But I guess, Matt, I mean, at this